What I'm about to say next isn't even an opinion at this point. In 2025, it has become fact. Launch day is the worst possible time to play a video game. Okay, so where's the paradox? Well, the harsh reality of video games is that if you want to support a developer, you need to buy their game at launch. But if you do, you will have the worst possible experience with that product. And if you don't, the companies making the games will run out of business. And sadly, it's mostly the developers, the actual people making the games we love, that have to suffer. So, what does that actually say? It means that the most dedicated fan base, the ones who keep the lights on, for lack of a better term, are the ones who will play the shittiest version of the games they paid for. I'll cover some well-known cases, but also the 2 times it happened to me personally, which nearly stopped me from ever playing games at launch again. But before we get into that, we need to step back and look at how unique this problem really is. Because in no other industry, no other form of media, do you run into something like this. At the end of the day, a video game is a product. Someone makes it, sells it, and you buy it. Simple. But imagine if that worked the same way with something like a TV. You bring it home, and for the first month it randomly shuts off every hour, or the sounds randomly cut out. But of course you'll get a free fix down the line. What if you bought a book and it had some missing pages here and there, a lot of typos, but every week or so someone would come to your house and bring you a slightly corrected version of that book, for free of course. Oh, and by the way, if you buy the broken book today, when it launched, that'll be $70. If you buy it a year from now, that'll be $20, and it's also the final version of the book, even with 2 new added chapters that add a lot of background to the main character, as well as the real ending. So, you see how stupid that sounds? Well, unfortunately, that's exactly the case for video games. Cyberpunk 2077's launch was one of the biggest disasters the industry had ever seen. On PC, the game was in a rough state no doubt, but at least it was playable. On consoles though, especially the PS4 and Xbox One versions, it was borderline unplayable. The game had constant crashes, frame rates dipping into single digits, textures that refused to load, characters T-posing, quest-breaking bugs. The game simply wasn't ready to launch. And here's the worst part, although it's blatantly obvious. CD Projekt Red, the developers of the game, knew it. They knew exactly what state the game was in. That's why reviewers only got access to PC codes ahead of launch, while footage of the console versions was hidden until the last possible moment. They deliberately withheld how broken the PS4 and Xbox One builds were and still shipped the game anyway. And the crazy thing is, that decision didn't bite them in the ass like it should have. Not at all. It actually made them millionaires. So how on earth do you think this won't happen again and again if we, the consumers, respond this way? Honestly, they'd be stupid not to do it again. It should go without saying that I don't mean that they'll do it deliberately. But why would they wait to release a complete, polished product when they can release a shitty version of it, make millions, then simply course correct? Indeed, Cyberpunk 2077 was a masterpiece of a game beneath all that mess. In the case of games like Mind's Eye, for instance, course correcting would mean to press Shift-Delete on that game and starting it from scratch. But that's not the point here. Cyberpunk had around 8 million pre-orders, with nearly 3/4 of them digital. That means, before anyone even got their hands on the game, it had already made back its development and marketing costs. And once launch week hit, the sales only skyrocketed further. Within just 3 weeks, the game had sold over 13 million copies across all platforms. And estimates put around half those copies for PlayStation and Xbox. Think about that for a second. Millions of people spent full price on a version of the game that was flat out broken. The backlash was so bad, Sony had to pull Cyberpunk from the PlayStation Store entirely and issue refunds, something that almost never happens. But out of all those 6 million copies, how many do you really think asked for a refund? The launch was so front-loaded, CDPR had already walked away with record profits. That's the launch day paradox in action. The people who pre-ordered, the people who showed the most faith, were punished with the worst possible version of the game. I'd say a borderline unplayable version. Meanwhile, people like me, who waited, got to experience it years later as a polished, feature-complete RPG with all the bells and whistles. A game that, today, is rightfully considered one of the best in the genre. But you know what would have stopped them from ever doing that again? The answer is as obvious as the day is long. You know how you can be absolutely sure they'll release The Witcher 4 in a close to perfect state? Don't pre-order it. Speak with your wallet. That's the only language these companies speak. And it seems like I'm being harsh on CDPR. And honestly, I am. And remember what I said about the game earlier. It's one of my favorite games of all time, and I consider it a masterpiece in design, in storytelling, in gameplay, art direction, music, everything. Really. But companies shouldn't be rewarded for intentionally releasing broken products. I'm not saying they should be punished. That's a big difference. No, they simply shouldn't be rewarded for it. They shouldn't become millionaires for selling you a broken product. What if the Avengers Endgame movie, for instance, released without a lot of CGI? Or without the Thanos scenes? Or with Mark Ruffalo behind the green screen with plastic balls stuck to his head? Do you think the movie would have had the same success? I think not. Moving on to the most recent example of this happening, and one that hits close to home for me, is Borderlands 4. You're probably aware that this is actually a similar example to Cyberpunk's launch, although not nearly as egregious. Borderlands 4 is playable, unlike Cyberpunk, but it still lacks a lot of polish. The game is great, and is actually a return to form at least in terms of its mainstream appeal, but the performance right now sucks. On PC, even high-end rigs struggled with stuttering, texture pop-ins, and random crashes. On consoles, the situation is arguably worse. Frame rates dropped the longer you played because of memory leaks, forcing you to constantly restart your systems just to keep the game running at a stable level. And it's quite funny, the worst performance of Borderlands 4 is reportedly on PS5 Pro. And those bugs aren't just cosmetic either. I've heard that some people lost skill points if the game crashed during multiplayer, and some progression simply got wiped. For a game with this much money behind it, the launch state is pretty darn bad. I mentioned at the beginning of this video I have two examples that hurt me most. Well, as Borderlands is one of my favorite gaming franchises ever, and having played Borderlands 3 on launch day, I'm pretty familiar with this situation. In fact, I was so excited for Borderlands 3, I played it on the Epic Games Store, because for those of you who might not remember, the game launched there exclusively for PC with a 6-month exclusivity period. So, I paid full price for the game, to play it on Epic Games Store, mind you, just to have a small little bug that whenever you aimed your sniper rifle, the frame rate dropped to like 15 FPS for a couple of seconds. Every single time I aimed any weapon with a scope. In a Borderlands game. So now I simply had to speak with my wallet. Borderlands 4 was one of my highly anticipated games of this year, but seeing the state the game launched in, I just don't want to put money in their pockets just yet. I know what you might think. My $70, just a drop of water in their ocean of millions, as the game sold extremely well already. But if you want to change the world, you gotta start with yourself. Of course, I will eventually buy the game when it's optimized and all polished up, because beneath all those performance issues, from what I've seen of the game, it will end up being the best game in the franchise. And I bet you 6 months from now, Borderlands 4 will most likely be the intended experience the developers envisioned. My final example is from a franchise I care about deeply, one that still pains me to talk about knowing it'll never get another sequel. Shadow of Mordor is a game I absolutely adored. In fact, it's the game that made me addicted to platinum trophies. I remember I borrowed an Xbox One from a friend that had it to play through the story. I beat the game and simply fell in love with it. In fact, I loved it so much that when I got a PS4, I replayed it, got the platinum trophy, and 100%ed all the additional content. So you can imagine when the sequel came out, Shadow of War, I couldn't wait to play it. And this particular example isn't that similar to the Cyberpunk one. Shadow of War wasn't buggy at launch or anything like that. The game was actually great, and of course I got the platinum trophy for it too. But with Shadow of War, the dark side of early adoption was of a different kind. For the sequel, they built an in-game marketplace where you could buy orcs, gear, and war chests with real money. And sure, technically you didn't have to use it. But when you got to the Shadow Wars endgame, the part you had to beat to unlock the true ending and the platinum, the grind was so boring and repetitive that the game almost felt designed to push you towards spending money. Hours and hours of repetitive fortress defenses, slowly gathering the orc captains you needed, while the store was sitting right there offering to help you skip the grind with your credit card. For me, it wasn't necessarily a big deal at the time. I enjoyed the game and didn't spend an extra dollar in order to finish the game completely. But for a single-player game, you can imagine the studio got a lot of backlash from the community. The real problem for me though was that slowly but surely Monolith came out and said that the microtransactions risked undermining the heart of the game. Less than a year later, in July of 2018, they ripped the whole system out of the game completely. The marketplace was gone, the Shadow Wars endgame was streamlined, renamed the Epilogue, and made into, let's be honest, what should have been from the start. And that's when I realized that someone who didn't give a shit about this franchise one way or another, that played the game a year after its release for like $30, got to experience a way tighter, cleaner game that wasn't trying to milk every cent out of the one who's playing it. Unfortunately for everyone, Monolith Studios has been shut down by Warner Bros. In February of 2025. So where does the launch day paradox leave us? Can it ever really be solved? And how far will companies keep pushing our patience? Honestly, I don't think this problem is going away anytime soon. Real change will only happen when we vote with our wallets. Because right now, these so-called mistakes don't cost companies anything. In fact, they make them a lot of money. So, you really want games that don't run like shit at launch? Then simply stop buying them.